It's my pleasure today to introduce Laurel Harbridge-Yong, my colleague in political science. We've known each other since we were in the same grad program together quite a while ago. Laurel studies partisan conflict with a focus on the US Congress. In her work, she takes up themes like the extent to which voters blame or punish people for compromising with members of the other side. She's looked at the momentous change in the House since the 1970s. In the 1970s, she shows us, House leaders were prioritizing bipartisan legislation. And today they're doing nothing of the sort. They're prioritizing legislation that's just not partisan at all. I'm sorry, just not bipartisan at all. And in her most recent book, she looks at the ways in which primary elections impede compromise in Congress. And she also takes up reforms that stand a chance of increasing compromise in Congress. I'll be remiss if I fail to say that Laurel is also a sensational colleague. It's hard to overstate, it really is hard to overstate how much she does for the department, but not just for our department. IPR also benefits. So for example, Laurel was the co-chair with Bo of our 50th anniversary celebrations just a few years ago. Now today, Laurel is going to be speaking about the conflicting pressures that modern candidates face when they run for office in the US. Some pressures imposed by primary elections, and then a very different set of pressures imposed by general elections. We're going to follow the usual IPR rules today, so please silence your cell phones, hold all but clarifying questions till the end, and wait for a microphone, this microphone, before asking questions. Laurel, take it away.
All right, well, thank you, John, so much for that very kind introduction. And thank you to all of you for coming out today, both those of you here in person, as well as those of you joining us remotely online. So I'm really excited to share this work with you today. So this I want to acknowledge is joint work with Sarah Anderson and Daniel Butler. It includes both some recently published work and then some of our current work in progress that we just started over the last several months. And so our motivation for this project stems from a set of concerns that we have about contemporary politics. So one of these concerns is that polarization contributes to gridlock, to the partisan fighting over policy and even the partisan fighting over basic facts and kind of agreement to just get things done. The second concern, though, is also that elected officials are likely unrepresentative of the broader population. And in part, we think that this is because they may be more attentive to primary voters than to the general population or to the general electorate, which itself is not perfectly representative of the broader population. But the skew kind of gets worse and worse as you go kind of into the narrowness of who participates in these elections. So more concretely, this project grew, or our current project grew out of our recent book, Rejecting Compromise. And in this book, we asked legislators, we're trying to understand their refusal to accept what we called half-loaf compromises. So the type of compromise that moved policy partway to what they wanted, but not all the way. And one of the key findings in that research was that legislators' belief that primary voters would punish them for compromising was an aspect that seemed to deter them from accepting these sorts of compromises, which are basically necessary in our structure of government at both the state level and the national level to avoid gridlock. Not every legislator is going to get everything that they want on policy. So for instance, we asked state legislators about a proposal on the gas tax that would move policy halfway towards their preferred policy alternative, but not all the way. And we found that around a quarter of legislators said that they would reject this compromise. And one of the key determinants of why they would reject that compromise was their belief that constituents would punish them for compromising. And when we dug into this perception more, we found that they were often focused on the beliefs or what they thought were the beliefs of primary voters. So I want to just cover two of the key findings in that respect. So first, it's a survey. So both of these pieces of information are going to come from surveys that we did on state legislators around the country. And so we focused again on scenarios that involved a compromise proposal where a legislator would get some but not all of what they wanted on policy. And in this survey of state legislators, after describing the kind of scenario of compromise, and we varied what sort of policy this was on, we asked the state legislators whether they thought that their primary voters and whether their general voters would want them to vote yes or no on this proposal. And what we found is that only 18% of legislators thought that their general election voters would want them to vote no on the compromise. So most people recognized that their general electorate wanted them to support a compromise. By contrast, nearly 60% thought that their primary electorate would want them to vote no on the compromise. And this perception carries over into what legislators thought would be the likely electoral outcomes for supporting a compromise. So we asked them how likely they thought each group would be to punish them electorally if they had voted in favor of a compromise. And what we can see here are the patterns for their views of the primary electorate and the general electorate. And what we see is that the percentage of legislators who thought that punishment is either somewhat or very likely, so the two right-hand bars of each group, are substantially larger for primary voters than they are for general election voters. And by contrast, the fraction saying not at all likely, the furthest right-hand side there, furthest left-hand side, is highest for general election voters and much lower for primary election voters. So ultimately, more than 58% of legislators believe that their primary voters were either somewhat or very likely to punish them for compromising, compared to only 26% of general election voters. So this suggests, I think, two important points. First, that legislators believe that primary and general election voters have different preferences. And second, that these preferences carry over into electoral consequences. So even though other parts of our book ended up showing that majorities of all respondents and even majorities of self-identified primary voters generally did favor compromise, even on these kind of same specific policy scenarios that we had given legislators, and this suggests that maybe legislators have a misperception of what primary voters want. These findings contributed to us kind of thinking more about, let's assume that legislators are right. Let's assume that there are different preferences on some issues between their primary voters and their general voters. Do legislators really have electoral incentives to side with the primary electorate over the general electorate? Because in the US system of politics, we know it's a two-stage process. But we also typically think that primaries can't pull too far out to the extremes because the general electorate will kind of rein things back in, and that legislators have to be mindful of the general electorate. But in this project, we've really been trying to think about, given that legislators are needing to appeal to both of these electorates, are there actually cases where the incentives fall that they're actually better off electorally siding with the primary, despite the potentially negative consequences for broader kind of representation and policy making? And this, of course, got us thinking more about, why does this matter in a bigger picture sense? And as I'll explain more in a moment, there are reasons to believe that primary electorates do differ on policy, at least on some issues. But it also kind of suggests that the kind of way in which turnout in these different levels of elections combined with legislators' electoral incentives might raise some real concerns about equity in politics. So just a couple of statistics here to kind of get us thinking along these lines. So if we think that it matters who turns out in elections for who legislators are responsive to, we can think about just kind of the numbers about who turns out and from which types of groups. So first, even in a presidential election year that it was very competitive and had high turnout, high mobilization, only around 60% of the voting eligible population turned out. So this is from 2016. In 2016 as well, so you have a contested presidential primary in both the Democratic and Republican primary. Only about 30% of the voting eligible population turned out in the primaries. And this was as of May 2020, where the primaries were still at least somewhat competitive and kind of decisive as to what was happening. You can imagine that the June primaries or something, after it was all but decided essentially who was moving forward as the candidates, the turnout would be lower. But this is taking into account all those early states, Super Tuesday states, everything else. So not a large fraction of the population are engaged in these elections. Moreover, given a particular level of turnout in an election, there are great disparities across different socioeconomic and racial groups in terms of who is turning out. So take the example here of the 2010 midterm elections. So in this case, just under 49% of non-Hispanic whites reported voting, compared to 44% of Blacks, 31% of Latinos, and 31% of Asian Americans. So even compared to their share of the population, these groups are turning out at much lower rates than their white counterparts. We see similar patterns if you look, by socioeconomic status or other factors, where again, you might be worried that if legislators are ultimately crafting their policy stances on the decisions of kind of what primary voters want, we're leaving out a really big swath of the electorate in terms of who's being well represented by our elected officials. So now I want to turn to kind of telling you a bit more about the current project that we're working on in this area. So the existing literature points to several different avenues by which primary elections might contribute to polarization. And there's somewhat mixed evidence for several of these in terms of the empirical side. But we can at least think through kind of the conceptual side of why might primaries matter here. So first, primary elections or primary voters might have different and more extreme views. And this might lead to the selection of more extreme candidates who then go forward in the general election. So in a general election, then the voters simply just have a choice between these two very polarized candidates. Given the sequential nature, they don't really have the chance to, opt for a third alternative that's closer to the center. So this might contribute to kind of broader polarization by electing more extremists into office, even though the general electorate might have ideally preferred a more moderate candidate. Second, we might think that electoral rules compound this problem. So closed primaries allow only registered partisans to vote, in contrast to open primaries that allow independents to vote in the primary. Might even allow people from the other party, if they wanted to, kind of cross over and vote in the primary that would be more consequential. And so again, this might kind of further emphasize the selection of extreme candidates. This is one that there's not a whole lot of empirical evidence for, looking at state-to-state variation on this, but certainly the logic might apply. The challenge is just that who turns out in primaries doesn't end up mattering, or doesn't end up differing that much between your open and closed primary election systems. A third way in which primaries might also contribute to polarization is that if a legislator receives a primary challenge, or maybe even just fears that they will get a primary challenge, they will kind of shift their attention and kind of their positions to appeal to the more extreme wing of the party to avoid a future primary challenge. You saw examples of this after the Tea Party wave in 2010. So after seeing Mike Lee beat Bob Bennett in Utah, there were a lot of stories about how Orrin Hatch shifted his positions to take even more conservative positions than he'd been taking before, lest he be the next victim of a Tea Party challenge. And we could think about that in contemporary politics on both the left and the right. Certainly the progressive wing of the Democratic Party has elements that are pushing to kind of replace anyone who's not seen as sufficiently progressive with someone who is more aligned with the progressive wing of the party. But all of these, so the first two really are focused on the selection of candidates. The third is on how the fear of primaries might kind of shift legislators' attention. And our argument, which builds, I think, to some extent on this third point, points to what we think is a bit of an overlooked aspect of how primary elections can contribute to polarization. And that is that legislators might face electoral incentives to be more attentive to the preferences of primary voters. So when deciding what positions to take or how to vote on a given bill, legislators might recognize that issue positions are likely to matter more in the primary election than in the general election. And this may lead them to side with the primary electorate, even if it puts them out of step with the general electorate. So in terms of kind of thinking about what the existing literature from political science kind of tells us about why this might be the case, we can think about a number of different factors that kind of have been thought to shape both kind of positions of voters and also the positions that candidates might take. So first, as I alluded to before, in terms of the selection side of things, there is evidence that primary voters do hold different views than general election voters. Not necessarily on every issue, but on balance, primary voters tend to be more ideologically extreme than general election voters. Moreover, we can also think about the role that kind of party cues might have. And so, without a cue from party, other information might matter more. So in the context of a general election, we often think that many people are largely just voting their party ID. We see statistics about how 90+% of Democrats vote for the Democratic candidate, 90+% of Republicans vote for the Republican candidate. Obviously, within a primary election, you don't have that cue, or that cue is not that meaningful because all of the candidates have the same partisanship, at least in the kind of traditional primary election types. So kind of putting aside the top two from California or others like that. And so the kind of expectation that we have, or kind of our core kind of argument or hypothesis, is that alignment between a voter and their representative on policy issues should have a bigger effect on vote choice, and therefore on the incumbent's margin of victory in a primary election than in the general election. And I apologize, I went past one slide I wanted to just briefly touch on here, which is just about kind of thinking about what the literature tells us on this more generally. So we do have evidence that legislators' voting records affects their evaluations and even affects their general election outcomes. So for instance, a canonical piece of work by Brandis Keynes Roan and colleagues called Out of Step, Out of Office looked at how legislators' voting records kind of controlling for district partisanship was a significant predictor of their vote share in the general election. So it does say, legislators' voting records do matter, at the margins within even general elections where party is on the ballot. There's also a broader set of research that shows that legislators' issue stances and whether they're aligned with respondents in surveys or not does affect evaluations of politicians. Some people have looked at this just in the context of primary elections to see kind of what sorts of factors people care about. Do they care about the race and gender of a candidate? Do they care about the issue positions? Do they care about whether they kind of are a good party soldier? These sorts of things. Others have looked at it kind of just in general, not in the context of a specific election. But I think the weakness of this existing literature and where we hope to make a contribution is that this existing work hasn't simultaneously studied the context of the primary and the general electorate to see kind of when push comes to shove, does the issue alignment matter more in one context versus in the other? And so, as I said a moment ago, our expectation is that the effect of alignment between a voter and their representative on policy issues is going to have a bigger effect on vote choice, and therefore on their expected margin of victory in a primary election relative to the general election. All right, so if there is a primary premium, so kind of empirically, if we do observe the existence of what we're calling this primary premium, this greater effective alignment in a primary election than a general election, we can think about two not necessarily mutually exclusive reasons why we might get that. So these are really just kind of mechanistic aspects. These are not necessarily really a theoretical story. It's really just, if we observe a primary premium, what might be the kind of reasons in terms of the different changes in behavior among different types of voters that would get us to this perspective. So first, we could think about how the behavior, even by the same set of people in the electorate, might differ across election contexts. So among the set of voters who participate in primary and general elections, what we're calling PG voters, the effect of alignment might have a bigger effect in the primary than in the general election. So let's take those of us in this room right now who, vote in both the primary election and the general election. I might be more attentive to my elected officials' set of issue positions in the primary than in the general, where I end up just relying on their partisanship as the primary cue to decide who I'm voting for. The second kind of potential mechanism here thinks about the composition of the electorate, and in particular, the composition of the general electorate. So in the general electorate, you have a really broad mix of people who are participating in politics. So you have people who might care a lot about the issue positions of candidates, these kind of PG voters, people who show up in the primary and in the general. And then you also have people who are less interested in politics, less knowledgeable about politics, and only show up in the general election, what we're calling G-type voters here. And it's possible that the composition of the general electorate, which includes both of these types of voters, could effectively water down the kind of influence that these PG voters are having. So let's say the PG voter, someone like me, I still use issue positions as a very important criteria in my vote in the general election. But there are also lots of people who aren't that interested in politics, who aren't caring that much about issue position, and they're only relying on party Q. So overall in the general election, the effect of issue alignment becomes smaller than what it would be in the primary election. So going from these kind of initial set of expectations, both about the existence of a primary premium and then kind of two potential reasons behind that, we turn to figuring out how we might test this. And so in our first exploration into testing our argument and expectations here, we were able to survey a very large set of respondents. So we did this on Lucid. So we had about 13,000 respondents, which yielded about 11,000 voters. And the reason that we needed to have such a large sample size is that we're effectively interested in the difference in difference between the effective alignment in a primary election and the effective alignment in the general election. And so we had conducted some pilots that suggested that we would need a sample size this large if we wanted to estimate a primary premium of 0.1, which we thought was a substantively meaningful difference. So within our survey, respondents began by answering a battery of questions on issue stances, so their own positions on issues. And these were asked in terms of support oppose. So we don't have extremity of position here. It's just kind of the binary, do you support or oppose the following policy proposals? And these covered a range of issues on gun control, abortion policy, renewable energy, pollution and the EPA, policing and the minimum wage. These were drawn from the 2016 Cooperative Congressional Elections Study. So the Cooperative Congressional Elections Study is a massive survey that's put together by a group of predominantly political scientists, though some from other disciplines as well. And the way that it works is that different faculty buy into the survey. And by buying into the survey, they get 1,000 respondents that they can kind of ask their own set of questions or modules to. But they also get access to the common content across all of the respondents. So they're only paying for kind of part of what they get, but they're contributing to this public good, which then, in 2016 ended up with 60,000 respondents across the country answering these questions because you had so many different researchers buying in to it. So in the common content questions, you have questions like this on kind of issue positions that people take. We also did ask how important people thought each issue was. We haven't done much with that yet, but it's something we're exploring in terms of thinking about both whether primary and general election voters differ in terms of how important they think particular issues are, and how that might kind of come into some of our analyses as well. Then we asked people a number of questions about demographics and about their political participation. Did they participate in the 2020 general, the 2016 general, primary elections, so forth. And then we turned to our kind of core survey vignette or experimental treatment in the study. And in this experiment, we first randomly assigned people to 3 of the issue stances that they had taken a position on. So they had taken positions on 12 issues, and we're going to randomly pick 3 of those. Then they're also randomly assigned to whether the hypothetical incumbent that they're reading about took positions that were aligned or not aligned with those positions. And then we're also going to vary what the electoral context is. And here, though, it's not fully randomized because we want to take advantage of the fact that some people actually are primary election voters and some people are not. So first of all, we in the analysis are going to drop anyone who didn't vote at all in 2016 or 2020 because we're only focused on kind of voters who are kind of, if we're thinking from the legislators' perception, whose preferences do they care about? You've got to be participating in politics to kind of matter in either the general or the primary by that thought. So if you only participated in the primary election, you were asked about a primary election. This is admittedly a small fraction of the real population, but you might think it could include people who were maybe disappointed with the selection of a candidate in the primary election for their party. So the ardent Bernie supporters, maybe opted to not turn out in the general election in 2016 or 2020. It could also include people who, illness or weather kind of prevented them from participating for kind of unrelated reasons to their own political views. Then if you're a general election only voter, you were asked about the general election contest. And if you voted in both the primary and the general election, you were randomized between these two election contexts as to whether you read about a primary or a general. One kind of nuanced point here about the general election voters is just that we're thinking about this from the perspective of the legislator. So general election only voters include co-partisans of that legislator who only vote in the general election, but not the primary, independents who don't participate in the primary election, and also all opposing partisans, regardless of whether they participated in a primary or a general election. So for instance, if you're a Republican respondent here in Illinois, even if you participated in the Republican primaries, you would be placed in the general election only category here because the incumbents in Illinois are Democrats. So everyone is going to get an incumbent who matches the partisanship of their own real senators at present. So if you are from one of the few states that have a split delegation, it's randomized, but otherwise it's just going to be what the partisanship of your actual senator is. So all of us here would get a Democratic senator because that's what we have here in Illinois. So in the vignette, it was kind of set up to be similar to what a kind of newspaper voter guide might have. So we first provided we repeated multiple times whether this was describing a primary or a general election. We also defined what we meant by a primary versus general election, so there shouldn't be any ambiguity over, what was this election really doing. So we described that a primary election, narrowed the choices within a party as to who would be the candidate, whereas a general election was choosing who would represent them within the office. And then we provided essentially a table that had pieces of information about the incumbent candidate A and a challenger candidate B. So we had information on their party, their prior experience, 3 issue positions that they took, a little bit of personal information about their family or religious background, and their prior career. And I do want to acknowledge that because we did the 3 positions here and kind of everyone either got 3 positions that were aligned or 3 positions that were not aligned, this is a relatively strong treatment. And I can explain more as we get to the results here as to, this does lead to us getting larger effects than we actually anticipated. And so we don't feel strongly that we have the exact precise estimate, but we think that the direction of our estimate is meaningful and valuable in terms of thinking about what's going on. But we were weighing kind of, how large of a sample would we need to get to only use 1 issue if we were going for kind of a smaller estimate in terms of what we were finding. So in terms of our measurement strategy for what we did with this, so the kind of core dependent variable measure that followed our kind of vignette or kind of table here was we asked people how they would vote in the election. And so they were told that this was an election for a Senate race. And so they had the option to vote for candidate A, vote for candidate B, or abstain and not vote at all. Because we did want to make sure we gave people that option, because particularly in the general election, that may be the option that people are taking. They may not be willing to reach over and vote for the other party, but they may choose to abstain and not show up at all if they're not happy with the options. So we actually haven't done anything in the analyses yet with the abstain, and that's something that we want to do in some future work, is really think about kind of how that is playing in as a kind of a reason, but it's not actually relevant to the calculation of what we're interested in, which is essentially our estimate of the incumbent's margin of victory if they take aligned stances to the respondent versus if they take non-aligned stances to the respondent. So the table is just giving our notation here in terms of you're randomized between the aligned and not aligned, and then you have the choices of abstaining, voting for the incumbent, or voting for the challenger. And so we calculate the effect of alignment then as being our estimate of the incumbent's margin of victory if they're aligned, minus the incumbent's margin of victory if they're not aligned. And then the primary premium is the difference between the effective alignment for those receiving a primary election context minus the effective alignment for those receiving a general election contest. So first, we look at all of our voters. So this includes our primary election only voters, general election only voters, and primary and general election voters. And what we see is that we have a large and significant effective alignment in primary elections, a large and significant effective alignment in general elections. And the difference between these, shown in the last column, is our estimate of the primary premium, which again is large and statistically significant. So this suggests that voters are more responsive to issue alignment in the primary than in the general election. So then turning to these kind of two mechanisms of how could we get to that first kind of pattern. So for this one, this is the test of that first mechanism that we have. And so here we're only going to be interested in people who participate in primary and general election contests. So these are people who are randomized to either receive a primary election vignette or a general election vignette. And we do the same calculation in terms of the effective alignment in each election, and then the primary premium or the difference between them. And what we see here is a large, even larger effect than the overall effect, suggesting that this is a key kind of mechanism or route by which the primary premium kind of comes into play. When we looked at the electoral composition, so our kind of second mechanism, here we decided that the analysis probably made the most sense to just focus on co-partisans. So we're looking at basically in general elections, what is the effective alignment for people who are primary and general election voters, so those who we think are kind of more engaged in politics, and what is the effective alignment for general election only voters, but looking only at co-partisans of the incumbent, just so we're not comparing kind of apples to oranges here of having co-partisans basically make up the entire primary electorate, but opposing partisans, independents, and co-partisans in the general electorate. And what we see here is actually the opposite of what we would have expected if this were driving the primary premium. So what we see here is that the effective alignment matters a lot more for general election only voters than it does for primary and general election voters. So essentially what this kind of means, you kind of move away from our subscripts and everything, is that for people who are really engaged in politics and participate in primary and general elections, they care about issues, but they also really care about their party. So in the general election, they're actually just voting on the, well, not just, but we can, really emphasizing the party of the candidates. That people who care a lot about politics are not giving their vote to the opposing party, even if they don't like the issue position of the incumbent. By contrast, people who are general election only voters, so those who care enough to participate in politics, they do kind of identify with one particular party, but they're not as kind of hardcore partisans as the primary voters. They're actually more attentive to the issue positions that a candidate takes, more willing to kind of give their vote to the other party. And so kind of overall, then this would suggest not only is this composition story not contributing to the primary premium, but it's working against the primary premium. So up until this point, I think our results emphasize first that there does seem to be a significant primary premium, and that it's largely driven by these kind of changes in behavior between the electoral contexts. The next thing that we wanted to tackle was thinking about, well, how often does this matter? Because obviously, not all issues are places where senators are going to be cross-pressured. There are going to be a lot of cases where the median voter in the general election wants the same thing as the median voter in the primary election. And so here we turned again to the Cooperative Congressional Election Study. So again, leveraging the 2016, which the benefit being that it has a contested primary in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, so that we have good estimates of who is in the primary electorate within both parties. 2020, to some extent has that as well. 2020 does not have that on the Republican side. It has it only on the Democratic side. And so we have the same set of 12 issue questions in the 2016 CCES that we used in our survey. We also have about 9 other issues that we also used that are on topics like additional gun control questions, further immigration questions, so forth. So kind of getting a range of policy areas here. And essentially what we're interested in is using this really large survey to create state level estimates of what is the distribution of support among our general electorate within each state and among the primary electorate for the incumbent party of each senator within each state. And then we're going to combine these estimates of the actual distribution of preferences from this massive survey with our estimates from our experiment on the effective alignment. So we're essentially going to look at trying to estimate what's the change in vote share for a senator voting yes instead of no on each of these different issues in the primary election and then again in the general election. So we're going to take our effective alignment, which is taken from our survey experiment, and multiply this by the distribution of preferences on the issues taken from this massive 60,000 person survey. So this figure plots out the expected change in vote share in the general election on the x-axis against the expected change in vote share in the primary election on the y-axis. And what you can see is that, as we would expect, on most kind of votes, the senators are not cross-pressured. So we can see this in the kind of diagonal cells here. So they either, both constituencies want the legislator to support the policy over here, or both constituencies want them to oppose the policy over here. So in this case, legislators really don't kind of face a tension or a trade-off between these two constituencies. They can take the same position on a roll call vote that asks them, support or oppose on something and make the median voter in both of these electorates happy. And ultimately, this is 68% of the senator issue kind of pairs in the data. However, that does leave a meaningful set of issue positions in senators where they do face cross pressures. And so the next part is to kind of look at where the dots fall on kind of this set of diagonals as to when do they have incentives to side with the primary electorate versus when do they have incentives to side with the general electorate. So what we can see is that in these 420 votes, the legislator would lose more votes in the primary than they would gain in the general electorate. And in these 139 up here, they would gain more votes in the primary than they would lose in the general electorate. By contrast, you see kind of the 93 here and the 7 here, where legislators have incentives to side with the general electorate. So ultimately, what we found is that in 85% of the cases where a legislator is cross-pressured, the benefit of siding with primary voters outweighs the benefits of siding with the general electorate. So this, of course, one limitation is that it doesn't take into account what the expected margin of victory is for a candidate. So if a candidate expects to win a general election with 75% of the vote, they can be very willing to take a hit in the general election. If they only expect to win with 51% of the vote, they may be attentive to kind of a loss there, even if it's only a small change in vote share. And so that's something that we haven't tackled yet in terms of thinking about where this actually kind of bites. The other limitation or kind of point of caution on this is that it relied on our estimated effective alignment in the primary and general electorates as being the real truth of what the effective issue alignment would be. But we had this strong treatment that looked at 3 issues simultaneously. It's also, a survey experiment where it's not as costly to engage in a particular behavior as it would be in the real world. So the last thing I want to show you is kind of how we've been thinking about, how do we relax our assumptions about that estimate in a way to let us see kind of under what conditions do legislators still have an incentive to side with the primary electorate. And so in this table, we have the effective alignment in the primary and the general electorate in the first 2 columns here. In the next set of columns are essentially the counts from that figure before of kind of on how many issue senator pairs Is there an incentive to kind of, do you gain more from voting in the primary, lose more from voting in the primary, which both kind of give you incentives to vote in the primary, and similar for the general. And then in the last column, on what percentage of cross-pressured votes do you have incentives to vote with the primary electorate. The first row is our survey estimate. So that is just summarizing the same thing that I told you in the figure before, which is that 85% of cross-pressured votes, you have an incentive to side with the primary electorate. In the next two rows, we reduce the effective alignment in both elections, but particularly in the primary electorate. So the primary premium in the second row is 0.1, and the primary premium in the next row is 0.05, compared to almost 0.3 in what we had for our actual survey estimate. Then we move to a row where we actually propose the same effective alignment in primary and general elections. And then in the last three rows, we reverse these. We actually say, what if there was a general election premium? What if voters were more attentive to legislators' issue stances in the general election than in the primary election? And what we were struck by in terms of the findings here is that although the fraction of votes that they have an incentive to side with the primary decreases, across all of these cases, legislators have an incentive to side with the primary electorate over the general electorate in the majority of cases. And this is true if there's no primary premium. So there's still on 73% of these issue dyads where they're cross-pressured, they still face an incentive to side with the primary. And even if there is a general election premium. And the reason for this is that the primary electorate tends to be much more similar in their preferences. So when you take a particular issue stance, you're either gaining or losing a lot more people. And so this kind of cohesion within the primary electorate means that even beyond our kind of story that we started with about the kind of greater incentive to side with them because of this effective alignment, there seems to be a broader set of reasons here that's coming out in the data as to why legislators might care about the preferences of primary election voters. So before moving to a couple of kind of implications and wrap-up points, I just want to acknowledge two limitations of the many limitations of the study. So the first, as with any survey experiment, external validity is certainly a concern. We recognize that our study used hypothetical candidates. People didn't have strong kind of priors or information about the candidates other than what we provided. We used the strong treatment of 3 issues simultaneously. And part of the reason that we use the hypothetical candidates is we didn't want to engage in deception about the voting records of actual members of Congress. If we only use their real voting records, we would be a lot more constrained in which ones we could actually randomize across respondents in terms of whether they took aligned or not aligned positions. Because even if you looked at these 25 different issues, depending on what positions respondents took, you may not be able to find a set of issues where they are aligned versus not aligned. It's also the case, there have been some studies within political science that suggest that while your point estimates might change if you use hypothetical or real candidates, the kind of general insights that you get don't differ too much. So that was kind of somewhat reassuring. The other things, though, that I think make us feel that we do have something valuable to say, even kind of acknowledging some of the external validity concerns, is that in some respects, we're really, because we're interested in the difference in difference, to the extent that we're overestimating the effect of alignment in both elections, it gets washed out essentially in the difference in difference. So the external validity concern has more bite if we think that, people are, that the external validity differs in our primary context versus our general context. But then I think also that last table that I showed you that highlights how even if we relax the assumptions of the estimate of the effect of alignment, we still get these same insights about the power of primary voters. A second potential limitation is about strategic voting. So some people think that in primary elections, people engage in strategic voting. The idea here is that they see it as a multi-stage game. They recognize that if I vote for my most preferred candidate in the primary election, they may not win in the general election, and I'll be left with my least preferred alternative from the other party. So in the context here, you might think that Democratic voters in West Virginia might not like Joe Manchin's issue positions, but they might recognize that Joe Manchin is the only Democrat who can win in West Virginia. And so they aren't going to care about the effect of issue alignment in the primary, because if they did, they would move someone forward to the general election who had no chance of winning. So empirically, the evidence for strategic voting is not great. Most people are not super sophisticated about how they engage in politics. The evidence that does exist here seems to suggest that a minority of voters, so estimates from 5% of primary voters to 18% of primary voters, engage in strategic voting. So it's probably not a huge issue, although we are thinking about ways to do either additional analyses with this or kind of follow-ups that seem to try to prime how competitive a general election would be and whether you think your own position aligns with the kind of average voter in the general election or not. So taking that as kind of my concluding points here, going back to kind of where we started about why we think this matters, is that if legislators have these incentives to be more attentive to the primary electorate than the general electorate, turnout in primary elections matters for representation. It matters for what policies legislators support, what we get as policies nationally within the country. We know that kind of generally on an ideological spectrum, primary electorates are not representative of the broader electorate. And as I pointed to in terms of some statistics before, white turnout is higher than other ethnicities in all elections, and this is even worse in primary elections than in general elections. Similar patterns of kind of disparities here on socioeconomic status, younger versus older voters, and other dimensions that we might care about, there being real differences in the preferences of people in the public. And so the kind of place that we hope to go next with this broader project is thinking more about who doesn't turn out and what kind of literature from the more kind of mobilization side tell us about how could we turn general election only voters into primary and general election voters. So not even trying to convert the people who aren't in politics at all, but at least those who are participating in general elections, can you get the primary electorate to look more like the general electorate in terms of their preferences. So with that, I will open it up to questions.